Okay, welcome back. It is 7/23 of 2015. We're going to take a look at the next section of this essay from 1914. And this time we're going to take a look at the transition from the pleroma of the many to the teleiosis of the manifold. We begin with the primary presentation of the pleroma of the many. And Brentano says that a differing from teleiosis at its maturity is always a constant for any sign-like thing. And the primary spatial continuum is always presented as a flat plane, but it will transition to the cyclical moment where it acquires its fourth dimension, and the fourth dimension is eschatological possibility. But we do intuitively acquire the sign-like things in the primary presentation as a topoid, and a topoid is from the Greek, and it means a thing in its proper place. So the first thing we do is we acquire the thing in its place, in its interrelated location. And Brentano says the overarching spatial boundary always remains equivalent regardless of the change in motion, that is, motion and rest within it. Now, in this primary presentation, the spatial continuity offers up two presentations. It offers up the presentation of the primary continuous many, which is the concreto, and the secondary continuous manifold, which is the abstracto. And at the concreto level, we are acquiring the things within our view of an event, and we are grasping them as the topoids in their interrelatedness within a spatial continuity. But at the secondary level, we are grasping that topoid and lifting it to signification in the secondary sense. So he closes out with an axiom that the spatial continuity boundary does have a determinate finite magnitude of enclosure. It encloses a very specific number of sign-like things, which we grasp as topoids, and we want to raise these, but initially our unitary intuition apprehends the primary presentation as a concreto, or holistic boundary of many spatial parts. Many spatial parts and their interrelatedness as topoids in their interrelated place. We want to raise that up to the secondary level of abstracto, and that becomes a secondary object, and it has to take place in the cyclical realm of presentation. So let's take a look at that abstracto realm and proceed to the second moment. Here we learn that the teleiosis is never to be limited in extension, and it is never a singularly isolated teleiosis either. Now the summation of the many parts as a manifold will create the totally new. So how do we acquire this secondary presentation as an abstracto? How do we lift concreto to abstracto? From the concreto many, we form the abstracto manifold new. We form the manifold character of the truly oneness, or the truly one unity of these topoids in their interrelatedness. We want to lift that to a true unity. And we have to form that abstract enclosure name. But in order to do that, we have to acquire, as you remember from the previous lecture, we have to acquire the relevant mark that each topoid bears, which will allow it to be lifted to signification. And now we get the detail as to how this takes place, because we really didn't get that in the last talk about how this relevant mark is acquired or what it means. But here he tells us we do this by momentarily presenting to ourselves inwardly, subjectively, a temporal continuum. So even though we're not formally involved in that work of secondary continuum of the temporal eschatological direction, we do offer ourselves a momentary inward temporal continuum presentation. Therefore, each sign-like topoid bears a momentary temporal continuum mark. We look for just a momentary temporal continuum mark in each of the sign-like topoid things that are enclosed within our spatial boundary. And then through a summation of marks, we did mention that last time, but through a summation of the marks, we acquire the manifold signs of unity in their abstractly identified generalization of unity. And this implies an acceptance of the true for each of the topoid signs within their additional temporal mode. So it's kind of a transitional moment before we get into that obliquo acquisition of the secondary temporal continuum. Before we enter into the true obliquo acquisition, we have this moment of, if you remember from last time, of acquiring the relevant marks. And the relevant mark, now we learn in this lesson, is acquired through a momentary temporal continuum mark that we allow for each sign-like topoid that is in its proper interrelated place that we acquired in primary presentation as a concreto. So we look at that concreto as a holistic enclosure within a continuous boundary. We want to raise concreto to abstracto, and to raise it to abstracto, we have to just posit a very momentary glimpse of the temporal continuum, just to identify these topoids as the true, as notions of the true, to give them that element of signification, and to raise them to actually be considered topoid signs. They become they transition from thing to a topoid of interrelated place, and then from place we lift them to true signification and interrelatedness as signs enclosed within an abstract generalized identity in this secondary presentation. So we raise concreto to abstracto. But in this lesson, he gives us a little bit better idea of what that means. He gives us a little bit better idea of what it means to acquire the relevant mark. In the prior lesson, we just really got a glimpse that we were supposed to acquire these relevant marks, but we didn't know how could it, the sensate presentation of a thing actually possess a relevant mark of sharing between concrete sensate things. Well, it's because the concrete sensate things have been lifted to a topoid of interrelated spatial identity and interrelated spatial placement within a continuous spatial enclosure. And once we have that picture, once we have that concreto holistic enclosure, we can take the concreto enclosure and we can lift it, because we allow ourselves a momentary positing of a momentary temporal continuum mark. So it is a internal externality positing. It's a moment. This is like a moment of our very first positing of the notion of the true. We posit a notion of the true for these topoids. We lift them to signification, and by doing so, we identify their relevant mark of belonging to a unity, a signified unity that points beyond itself. Remember, sign is that which points beyond itself to something more significant. So we can lift the entire temporal enclosure to a signified abstracto enclosure, which gives the enclosure a signification, but in the process we're lifting each of the topoids to a sign-like quality of a notion of the true themselves, because Brentano says that this action does imply the acceptance of these topoids as the true, as notions of the true. So it is a moment of actually identifying the notion of the true, which we are very familiar with from Hegel's system. And this is that moment in Brentano's system when we do lift topoids to the notion of the true. We give them that signification lifting, and thereby by adding together the summation of these momentary temporal continuum marks, we can form the abstracto generalized identification of this signification event. We lift it to signification event rather than simply a temporal continuous enclosure. It becomes a signification event that will be empowered by a secondary continuum of the temporal continuum, which we acquire through the obliquo indirect spiritual acquisition. And that will be the third moment when we will actually lift this manifold signs of unity to their eschatological directional double continuum, which is a continuum of place and a continuum of eschatological directional empowerment. And so we really gain quite a bit more this time on what it means to really grasp the relevant mark. And we'll pick up next time on page 35.